Look, $3 is not going to fill the refrigerator. It's not going to make a dent. But $3 will buy you 3 lottery tickets that will give you the potential to fill the refrigerator. Are you talking to the widow living on a fixed income? Because the advice is going to be completely different. There is a lot of bad advice. There are a lot of people who look fairly reputable. Scam is the wrong word because that implies that wealth is what you don't see. Wealth is what's hidden.
What is the story that people say, wow, that really had an impact on me, or that really helped me to understand this concept of personal finance?
I think one that resonated a lot and resonated with me personally too, it was maybe my favorite, is just the idea that there is no one right answer in finance. I think we tend to think of finance, and finance is taught like it's math. And in math, there's one right answer for everybody. No matter who you are or where you're from or how old you are, it's just like 2 + 2 = 4 for everybody. That's how math works. And finance is, in my view, it's not like that at all. That people who are equally smart, equally educated, equally informed can come to totally different conclusions about how to manage their money. And I think once you embrace that, it does 2 things. One, it makes you less cynical about other people and less judgmental about how other people are spending their money. And 2, it gives you permission to just be like, what works for you? You don't have to worry about whether you're doing it quote unquote right or wrong. If it's working for you and it's making you happy, then maybe it's the right thing to do. And there are things that I do with my own money, my wife and I do with our own money, that are probably the quote unquote wrong thing to do. That if you looked at it on a spreadsheet, you would say, oh, you should be doing this differently, but it works for us and it makes us happy and it helps us sleep well at night. So therefore it's the right thing for us to do. And I think once you have that little nugget of like, nobody's crazy. People do crazy things, but everything that people do with their money makes sense to them. It works for them. And yes, there's always room for improvement, and people can be misinformed and do things that they're going to regret. And we should try to help them understand what their options are. But people do so many different things with their money. Can I give you one quick story that's in the book that I really liked? The majority of lottery tickets in the United States are purchased by the poorest Americans. The lowest decile of income earners buy the majority of lottery tickets. Now, someone like me or you might look at that and say, that's crazy. These people who can barely feed themselves are buying scratcher tickets. That makes no sense. It's not rational. I have a friend who's a financial advisor. He's successful now, but he grew up in abject poverty. He was homeless most of his childhood. And he told me a story one time that he remembers when he was a child and his refrigerator was empty and his mom had $3 to her name. And he said, look, $3 is not going to fill the refrigerator. It's not going to make a dent. But $3 will buy you 3 lottery tickets that will give you the potential to fill the refrigerator. And he said, until you can understand that mindset, you don't understand why these poor people are buying so many lottery tickets. When it's your only chance of hope of literally feeding your kids in this situation, it doesn't make sense. And so that's an extreme example, but it just shows like there's so much going on inside of people's heads, and there's no one right answer of what's the right thing to do. Then I think all of us just need to find out what works for us, be a little more introspective about who we are and what we want and what our goals are, our social aspirations are, and just find a plan that works for us.
I feel like some people are just looking for a formula. What is the closest thing to a formula you could give them?
That's a great question because I don't know the answer off the top of my head. If the formula was like, if you wanted to break it down in like the simplest terms of like live below your means, save the difference, invest in for the long term, and like be diversified, like it's probably something, I would say it's something really broad and non-specific like that. I think once people get into a formula of like save X%, then it's really different. Like, do you make $10,000 a year? Do you make $10 million a year? That's a big difference. One of my qualms, if you're watching like CNBC to invest, and you'll see the guy on CNBC who's like, you should sell Apple stock. And I want to be like, who are you talking to? Are you talking to the 19-year-old day trader? Are you talking to the widow living on a fixed income? Because the advice is going to be completely different there. So it's like, yeah, if there was a formula of like live below your means, save for the long term, but that's so dry and non-specific. But I honestly think in my view, that's as close to a formula as you can get. You just mentioned 10,000 steps. Okay, great. Save $1,000 from Dave Ramsey. Like, yeah, wonderful. But there's still going to be so many people who listen to that and might say, I can't save $1,000 or $1,000. I make $250,000 a year. That's not, so like, there's still a large number of people who are going to listen to that and say, that doesn't apply to me specifically. And I think it's almost like diet too, where are there principles of diet like eat your vegetables, eat like, yes, but there's also going to be people who are like, I'm gluten intolerant, so this doesn't work for me, and that doesn't, there's going to be so many differences within the group.
Yeah.
And I think especially for financial content, when by definition, you hope that so many different people are going to be watching this, all different ages, different income groups. The more specific it gets, the more dangerous the more dangerous it gets. And I think that's what's so dangerous about something like CNBC, where they're giving universal advice to a wide audience.
I know in your book, one of the things you talk about is this principle of greed and wanting things quicker, wanting your money to double quicker and not having that patience and the long-term vision for your money. Is that something that you think applies to everyone?
I think it's true that in most endeavors in life, there's a pretty quick payoff. So like if you go to the gym, you'll be sore tomorrow. Like there's an indication that something's working. If you're on like a new diet, you might feel different that day, the next day. It's a pretty quick thing. And so people take those payoff time periods, and when they apply it to investing, if they're new to investing, they might think, oh, I'm going to invest $1,000 and I'm going to check back next Wednesday and see how it's done. And then, or maybe I'll check back, 2 weeks from now and see what's done. 6 months feels like a long time, because if you were going to the gym for 6 months and you saw no progress, you're like, you're doing something wrong here. But in investing, like we know, it's not intuitive for people, but this is an endeavor where you might lose money over a 10-year period. And that doesn't mean you did anything wrong. Investing is a very, very long endeavor. I think the closest example is like planting an oak tree. Like if you planted a seed in your backyard and checked it next Wednesday and you're like, oh, it doesn't work, it's a scam. You're like, no, it takes a long time. And the results are going to be magnificent, but it's going to take 50 years. And I think investing is really close to that. And it throws a lot of people off. By far the biggest problem for new investors is not understanding how much time is needed to put the odds of success in your favor. And it's not a month, it's not a year, it's something closer to 5 or 10 years before you're like, okay, if you've given it that much time, you should start to see most likely whether you're doing it right or wrong. But even in that scenario, even in 10 years, even if you're doing it right, it's not without precedent at all that maybe you've done fairly poorly. If the economy is doing really poorly, if there's a financial crisis, if there's a pandemic, whatever it might be. So that's what it's really a lifelong endeavor. And that's what screws people up if they're not familiar with that time frame.
Besides the time horizon, what do you think are also the biggest mistakes that people are making when it comes to their money?
I think there is a lot of money to be made in the money business. And because of that, there is a lot of bad advice. And there are a lot of people who look fairly reputable and sound fairly reputable who are, scam is the wrong word because that implies it's illegal. I think you're the lawyer, maybe but there are a lot of people who I think mean well, but they operate in a system where the incentives push them to giving not the best advice and charging outrageous amounts for it. I always think like one of the best financial skills you can have is a very, very finely tuned BS detector, so that you can see an ad or hear a pitch and say like, I'm not saying you're a bad person, but that's a bad product that you're selling. Having that sensitivity is really important. And a lot of people don't, because there are a lot of other fields in their life that are pretty heavily regulated, medicine and whatnot. If you go to a doctor who has an MD, you can be reasonably sure, I'm not saying there's no bad doctors, but you can be reasonably sure that they are educated and tested and qualified, and the advice that they give you is very likely good advice. And in the finance world, there are things like CFP and CFA, these credentials that are pretty good, but there's no requirement that you have them. If you get surgery, that person has to have an MD. This would be a licensed surgeon. But you can go to a financial advisor who has very few credentials. Maybe they took a regulatory exam that took them 2 weeks to study for. They have a degree from Google effectively, and they can be a financial advisor. And so a lot of people kind of get taken for a ride because of this. And there are a lot of also just online, again, I'm not going to use the word scams, but just things online that want to push you in one direction or the next that leads to a lot of bad advice. And a lot of these too are not even commercial products to buy, but there's just so many blogs and social media feeds. I'm one of them. I'm not going to throw them all under the bus, but there's a lot of advice out there that is either bad advice or it's good advice for one person, but not for you. And I think having that sensitivity to information is really critical for new investors.
But it's so hard though, I imagine, for these new investors when you don't understand what you're looking for. It's hard, even if you have a good BS meter in general, it's very hard to know like who is good and who's looking out for you truthfully and who's
Super
good
hard.
for your specific personal finances versus who is not, right? Like if someone wears a suit and speaks very confidently, it's kind of easy to feel like, oh, they're trustworthy.
So easy, especially when the stakes are really high in money. This is sending your kids to college. This is retiring. This is not just a little game. This is like one of the biggest areas of your life. And since it's generally not taught in high school or even college, even if you are a very smart woman, very smart guy, highly educated, you have a degree in chemical engineering, you might know nothing about money. But I always say like the two areas of your life that are going to impact everyone, no matter whether they like it or not, are health and money. It doesn't matter if you don't like those fields are going to impact you. They're there, they're going to impact your life. So the fact that we generally don't teach those fields in school has always been crazy to me, but it also just makes it so that even very educated people who are not gullible in any other area of their life kind of get taken for a ride very often.
What are some red flags that people can look out for? So if you're mentoring someone who's 20 years old, new to this world of personal finance and money, what would you say, hey, if someone says, buy this product or do this with your money, what's the red flag that they should look out for?
I'd say in general, be very wary of certainty, including like certainty in forecasts. Like if someone says, we know that a recession is going to come in the next 6 months, or someone says, we know this stock is going to double. Any level of confidence like that is just not how the world works. The best that you can do when you're studying the economy or investment markets is just putting the odds of success in your favor. So the best you could do is be like, we're 60% confident in buying this stock. And if it's not pitched that way, if it's pitched in any level of this is a sure thing, run for your life. Because it just does not exist in this world. Outside of an FDIC insured savings account, certainty does not exist in the finance world, but certainty is what sells. And so that's why a lot of the pitches that are online promote this degree of certainty that I think can be really dangerous. That's a big red flag.
Do you think what's happened with social media and the accessibility now of personal finance information through social media is overall a good thing for people? Or do you think it is a bad thing because it is even now harder to differentiate between possibly the bad actors with ulterior motives versus the good ones who actually want to give good personal finance tips to everyone?
This is a boring answer, but I think it's the truth. I think it's on net good, but it's very slim. I think I'm making this up, but I think it's like 51% amazing and 49% terrible. Like it evens out to where it's like, I think it's on net a good thing. And it's a good thing because if you go back to the world before social media, most financial advisors were gatekeepers. If you were just an average Joe and you wanted to invest for your retirement, you want to buy a mutual fund, you need to book an appointment with a guy down the street, go into his office, wear your suit and tie, like wait in the waiting room so you could go have permission to invest in the stock market and pay him an egregious fee and commission to do it. That was the world that existed like 15 years ago, not that long ago. And I think it's a wonderful thing that it has been democratized so much, not just the access to financial products, but the access to information. And I don't think it's an exaggeration that an 18-year-old with an iPhone today has more financial information than a partner at Goldman Sachs did 20 years ago. That's not an exaggeration. It's like, so a lot of those people were just information gatekeepers too, the financial advisors. If you was like, forget buying a mutual fund. If you wanted to know what mutual funds existed 20 years ago, you had to go talk to that guy and pay him a crazy fee. And you don't anymore. So a lot of those financial advisors who are like commission-based, a lot of them don't exist anymore because it's been so democratized, both the information and the product access. That's an amazing thing. The other side of that, though, are the number of people who are either promoting products they shouldn't be, or people who are innocently putting advice on social media and whatnot, that they're very innocently, they're just naive to the fact that it might be bad advice to somebody else. They're not doing it. You can't criticize them. But if there's someone who went on and said like, oh, everyone should buy this stock, they just might not have the knowledge or haven't thought through that a 16-year-old in his mother's basement might listen to that, put his entire life savings into it and lose everything because he didn't know what the consequences of it were. So I think there's a lot of innocent bad information out there as well. You can't just put everyone in as like a bad actor. A lot of it is really innocent. And I think it's great that if you are someone who's interested in finance and you want to start a blog, start doing TikTok, start making YouTube, that's amazing. That's great.
Yeah. But
if you turned it a little bit and said, should everyone who's interested in medicine start posting medical advice? In that situation, you're like, might not be a great idea. But we do that with finance. So that's why I can see both sides of it. And on net, I prefer this world to the old world, full stop.
Yeah.
We're in a better position, but it is not without consequences.
I'm with you on that. I mean, it's interesting. Things like what happened with Dogecoin would not have happened pre-social media.
No way.
There's no
or
way you
even
could build
social
that.
media 5 years ago.
Yeah.
It was not that established. And things like GameStop in early 2021, these things that would have been unfathomable like 24 months ago are now the reality of the world we live in. I think a lot of that was COVID related too, where people who would otherwise be watching football games, going out with their friends, were all of a sudden stuck inside. And the only thing that you could do, all the sports were shut down in 2020. The only thing you could do was day trade. And the explosion in Robinhood accounts and crypto trading in 2020, you can mark it to the day that the lockdowns began. It just exploded after that. And again, I think a lot of it is great that a lot of these young people, teens and 20s, are now active participants in investing. And even if they are doing it in ways that they will regret, I would much rather that someone learn how finance works and learn how risk works when they're 19 versus when they're 45 and putting their kids through college. Like, it's actually great to the extent that Robinhood was sucking in a bunch of young investors. I'm kind of like, even if they end up regretting what they did, and a lot of them already have, I think that's actually a good thing.
Just for the people who are listening and may not know the difference between an investor and a trader, can you kind of go into how you define that?
I think a lot of it is the difference between like investing in a business for the long term, where I'm going to buy Apple stock because I believe in their products and their products are going to generate profits, and those profits will accrue to me as an investor over the next 20 years. That's investing. Investing in a business for the business results. Trading is, I'm going to buy a stock because I think the stock price will go up over the next week. And it's more of a speculative endeavor. And you might be right about that bet. You might make money doing it. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's a speculation that a stock price might rise versus I'm investing in a business whose profits are going to be paid out to me as dividends over the next 10 or 20 years. So part of it is time horizon, and part of it is just like the bet that you're making and why you are attracted to that company.
For the average person, when we talk about financial independence, so reaching a point where you can retire and not have to worry about money, it seems very unattainable if they're making, let's say, $15 an hour. What is your advice? What would you say for someone who is making $15 an hour and wants to eventually achieve financial independence? What should they be doing to get there?
There's two parts of it, like income and expenses. And breaking that down, so much of modern spending is spending to show other people how much money that you have. And what you actually need to live a pretty happy, dignified life, if your expectations are low enough, is really not that much money. Particularly if you're a single person or you're a couple that's on the same page doing this, it's not tremendous. And I think people would be surprised at how much modern spending is just like the keeping up with the Joneses effect. Travel, not travel for enjoyment, but travel for Instagram photos to show people where you've traveled, and clothes and cars and whatnot it's just, I always say, like, a lot of spending is the gap between your ego and your income. It's like so much of what we spend, not all of it, but so much of what we spend is just to signal to other people that you've made it. And if you can subtract at least part of that from your life, most people would be surprised at how little you can spend and live a happy, dignified life. Mr. Money Mustache, I mentioned before, he was the first to show that he was married with a kid, and his all-in total spending, he owned his house outright. So take housing payments out of the equation. Maybe that's unfair, but take it out. He was spending like 20 grand a year and living an amazing life. And so for a lot of people, there's a lot of room to play with the expense side of the equation. And on the inside of on the income side of the equation, it's like whether it's a side hustle or just moving up in the world, there's a lot of opportunity. Like this true, it still is, despite everything that's going on in the world, like the land of opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think a great thing that we're moving towards is probably a less of a world of credentialism, where you don't need to go to the right college or even any college to have a pretty good income these days. It's still, there still is a lot of that, but I think we're slowly moving away from the world of credentialism, more towards a world of like, are you good? Are you talented? Are you a coder? I don't care if you went to Stanford. If you're a good coder, you're going to have a good career in tech. So I think that's a positive movement on the on the income side of the equation.
What's funny when you mentioned that gap between, what did you say? The gap between
your ego and your income. That's usually like the amount of money that you're spending, or the amount of money that you're saving, is the gap between your ego and your income.
That's
it's just like, how much money do you make, and how much do you want to show the rest of the world how much you make? Is really like, you don't need that much to spend that much money to have a dignified life. A lot of it is the clothes, the cars, the house, to show other people.
Wow.
I always make this point too, that like showing other people, like waving your peacock feathers to show people that you've made it, is not an entirely bad thing. Particularly if you're young and you're like trying to find a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a spouse, then it's like, it's really critical that you're not dressing like a schmuck. Like, it's really important. It's easy for someone like me who's happily married to be like, oh, you don't need to do any of that. It's like, my wife's going to love me no matter what I wear, no matter what car I drive. But I'm not throwing that completely under the bus. But I think people, if they really dug into it, would be surprised how much of their current spending is just kind of a keeping up with the Joneses effect.
Yeah. Even myself, when I look back at 10 years ago, the way I was spending, when I had no money, I was in college working at Subway, and all of my Subway income, I would take it to the mall and buy shoes that I couldn't afford, purses that I couldn't afford.
Yeah.
But then it gets tough because at that time I remember I was buying Coach purses, but there's always a level up. Like I was proud of my $200, $300 Coach purses and was carrying them around. But then you have the people at my school who were carrying the Louis Vuittons.
Louis Vuittons, and it goes up from there.
And then it goes to the
never ends.
I don't know what's next. Maybe a Birkin.
I was gonna say the Birkin. I'm not an expert at this.
I also don't know.
I know there's some that get in 5
ending.
figures really quickly.
Yeah.
6 figures maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
It gets nuts.
And what's so funny now is like now I just cannot wear brand name clothing. I feel like.
See, that's smart. But do you think that's like a wisdom as you get older? That when you're 19, you can't really piece together, or maybe it is like I said, that when you are 19. That your ability to have nice clothes and a nice purse is really important. And even if you were to go back, would you tell yourself, don't buy the purse? Or would you tell yourself, actually, the purse made my friends think that I'm part of their group, and that was really important?
No, I think you're exactly right. I think if I were really to dig back into what it was I was insecure. I felt like I didn't fit in. I went from, I grew up in a military family. So my dad was in the military. Most of my graduating class didn't go to college. And I ended up at this school called Notre Dame. A lot of the kids there came directly from private high schools. And I wanted to fit in. I felt like I didn't fit in. So I wanted to buy whatever was necessary to make me feel like a little better, like, oh, wow, I belong here. And that's what it was. It was just this insecurity and wanting to fit in.
I don't know if do you think insecurity is the right word though?
Yeah.
Or is it more just like wanting to fit in when you're older, you have other things to hold on, your career and other like wisdom that you've learned. But when you're 21 or whatever, you don't have very much else to show other than your purse, so to speak, then maybe it's not so much of a bad thing. Sometimes I get stuck on this.
I don't know. For me, I feel like insecurity is accurate, but I was also young. I wanted to fit in more than I wanted to be smart with my money.
Yeah. But I also hope that when my kids are 19, that they do fit in. I don't want them to be so frugal that nobody wants to hang out with them. That would be a terrible thing. In that situation, I'd say, please go buy the purse so that they'll like it. Like, it's a really tough, I think there's no black and white answer for these things.
No,
it's a really tough thing.
There's not. But I'm glad I'm not spending like that now. I'm glad I've reached a point. Maybe it did come with age, or maybe it did come with the confidence that came with making more money that, oh, I don't feel the need to do that. Yeah. And it is never ending. It is, if I bought the Louis Vuitton, then I'd have to buy the Birkin.
Yeah. I do think that when you see a 45-year-old playing that game, whether it's the sports car game or the purse game, that I'm kind of like, there's something going on there. But I totally understand why the young person who's trying to, for the first time in their life, make it in the adult world and show the adult world who they are. Mm-hmm. I totally understand why it happens.
I understand why it happens, but it makes me sad because some of these young people will go into credit card debt.
Yeah.
And then it becomes very difficult. That could impact you for 10 years to climb out of that. And it becomes so, so difficult. So I wish if I could go back to my 20-year-old self, I would be like, you know what? You fit in. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. That's good advice. So during college, I was a valet at a really nice hotel in Los Angeles. And this was in the mid 2000s. There was so much money flowing through LA. And so as a valet, people would come in Ferraris and Lamborghinis and Rolls Royces. And as I got to know some of these people who would come in, I got to realize that like some of them were actually not that successful. These people driving in a $300,000 Rolls Royce were actually like not that successful. They spent half their income on a Rolls Royce lease payment. That was like a lot of these. And that to me was the first impression of like, so much wealth is fake, and fake it till you make it. And the thing that's so hard about wealth is that I can't see that guy's bank account. I can't see his brokerage statement. The only thing I could see was his car. And it gave me such a fake impression of what was going on. And the counter to that is there's so many people who would drive in a Honda Accord that you would never bat an eye at that are actually very wealthy. And so wealth is what you don't see. Wealth is what's hidden. Wealth is money that you did not spend, that is just like banked away in savings or in investing. And it's really difficult because like for something like physical fitness, you can see it. You can see, and then so it gives you more and more accurate view of a role model. You can say like, I want to look like this person. I want to do what they're doing. But for wealth, you don't have that. You might look at the guy in the Rolls Royce and say, I want to do what that guy did. And you're actually, no, actually you don't. He hasn't done that much. And the guy in the Honda Civic, Jeff Bezos used to drive a Honda Accord when he was a deca-billionaire. Like you might see him on the street and be like, what's that chump doing? Well, he's actually like an amazing, amazing person. So since so much wealth is hidden, I think it gives us a flaw of our role models and who we aspire to. And people really have to be careful using what they see as an indication for how successful that person is or is not. It's a really tough thing.
And it's funny because it goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning, like knowing who online to trust and who not to trust. There are reasons why people with Lamborghinis behind them making videos get more followers than people with, normal houses and normal cars.
Yeah.
It's because you associate that Lamborghini with, wow, he must be successful.
He must be smart. He must know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
I know it's one of the most pathetic things I've ever heard. There is like a cottage industry on Instagram of renting a private jet on the tarmac. You never leave, but you can rent it for an hour and go in and take your picture of yourself sitting in the jet and post it on Instagram. Some of these people will literally like Photoshop clouds into the window so it looks like they're flying, but they actually just paid $100 to rent it on the tarmac. And it's a huge, huge industry. I bet more than half the time you see a private jet photo on Instagram, it's on the ground. But to your point, the people who post it, now everyone who views them like, wow, that guy's in a $60 million jet. He must know what he's doing. We should follow that guy. It's so easy to fake it till you make it on social media.
Yeah, or you wear a fake watch and it's like, oh, look at his Patek Philippe.
Totally, yeah.
It is crazy. And a lot of it comes down to people wanting things quicker. And so they buy it before they can actually afford it. There's a story in your book I like that kind of is on this theme about over-leveraging. I don't know if you know which one I'm talking about.
Yeah, so two of the greatest investors of all time, Warren Buffett and his partner, Charlie Munger. Warren Buffett's worth $100 billion. Charlie Munger is a multi-billionaire. He's given a lot away, though, so he's not as rich as Warren. But they're two of probably like the Mount Rushmore of investors, the greatest investors of all time. And it's been this duo. They've been investing together for 60 years. And actually, if you go back to the 1960s and 70s, there was a third member of this group. It's a guy named Rick Guerin. And Warren, Rick, and Charlie used to be this investing trio. And they used to make investments together and interview CEOs together. And Rick Guerin kind of disappeared off the face of the planet. He was still around. If you looked, like you could still find him. But I was wondering, like, why did Warren and Charlie become household names and no one's ever heard of Rick Guerin? And I heard someone tell a story that they heard from Warren Buffett about what happened to Rick Guerin, which is back in the 1970s, he had borrowed a ton of money to invest. He was going into debt so he could buy stocks. It's called margin debt, leverage. And during a bear market in the 1970s, when the stock market fell a lot, he got wiped out. Because when you borrow a lot of money, if the stock market goes down 30, 40, 50%, you're done. You're completely out. And Warren told the story that he said, Rick was just as smart as he and Charlie were. He was just as talented as an investor. But he said, Warren and Charlie always knew that they would get rich, so they were not in a hurry. And he said Rick was just kind of in a hurry to get there. So he wanted to borrow money to speed up the process, and it blew up in his face. And that I thought was really interesting, that the people Warren is one of the richest men in human history, and he was not in a hurry at all. He said he knew it was going to happen. There was no rush. I thought that was a really interesting thing, that a lot of times when people try to speed up the process above its natural rate of growth, it's just going to backfire on you.
Yeah.
And I think that had a big impact on me. It's so natural to want to speed it up. And in a perfect world, I would love to get rich overnight, of course, but it's just not how it works. There's usually a natural speed at which these things occur. And when you try to speed them up above that level, it's going to come back to bite you.
And that's why a lot of these get rich quick schemes, you can never trust them.
You never trust it. Warren has a great quote about investing on margin, borrowing money. He says, if you're smart, you don't need it. And if you're dumb, you shouldn't be using it. Like there's no justification to be using it. I thought that was a big takeaway, but a lot of investors do. Even first-time retail novice investors, you open up an account with E-Trade or Robinhood and you can go into margin debt. You can borrow money to buy stock. And a lot of people don't realize the ramifications of that until you're in a bear market like we are now. And some of these stocks fall 50, 70, 80%, and they're wiped out. They lose everything.
Yeah.
It's a tough situation.